One last caveat before I begin the presentation. This is sort of a riff on stuff I've done with sand skinks and blue-tailed mole skinks, which, as the introduction said, are both federally threatened species that are restricted to scrub habitats in the interior of the Florida Peninsula. But we do quite a bit of habitat restoration and management for those species, and the work we do with those species, because I'm sure you're all familiar with, animals get more attention, especially if they're bigger and cuddlier, or furrier at least, than other species than the plants. But they can work as good umbrella species for conservation, and that works for gopher tortoises and other species as well. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. Oh, I need to request screen sharing.
Good to go.
All right, perfect. Okay. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, good. All right, so as I said, I'm sure some of the folks, I recognize a few names on here, are very familiar with scrub habitats, but I'm just going to go from the basics, and bear with me if you know all this stuff, but I'll try to continue on through for folks as much as possible. Okay, so first off, what is scrub? So scrub is one of our upland habitats in Florida, found on very well-drained, deep sandy ridges. Most scrub, if not all of it, at one point were sand dunes and beaches in the past. So think of a desert that gets a lot of rainwater, and you got a good idea of scrub. So plants grow pretty well on it, but the dominant vegetation is evergreen shrubs. You may have a pine canopy or may not, and several different species are sort of characteristic of scrub. There's 4 oaks here that characterize what we call oak scrub. So Chapman's oak, sand live oak, myrtle oak, and scrub oak. And scrub oak is not found in all scrubs. That's the most range restricted species that you'll find on the Lake Wales Ridge, especially in the southern part of the Lake Wales Ridge. You also find rosemary scrub, where rosemary is the dominant species. The southern Lake Wales Ridge will have lots of rosemary, or areas of rosemary scrub. These scrubs where rosemary is dominant tend to have a lot of bare sand interspersed with rosemary shrubs. And coastal scrub in the panhandle often has Florida rosemary as the dominant species. And then the third variety or flavor of scrub is sand pine scrub, where sand pines form a canopy over the scrub oaks and rosemary. All these species can co-occur in the same scrub. So the different flavors of scrub, as I describe them, are just sort of which species tend to be more dominant in those scrubs. But you'll find all sorts of mixes of these species together. So where is scrub? I already mentioned it's on sand beaches, but just a little bit of geological history of scrubs. So the Pleistocene period in North America coincided with ice ages. And as the glaciers expanded and retreated, we had vast fluctuations in sea level rise. So we had periods where sea levels were much lower and the peninsula of Florida extended far out into the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see in this image here, where the interior part of the peninsula was generally higher. But at other times, the sea level may have been up to 100 feet higher than it was now. So I had a hard time finding good images all in the same format. But here the black areas represent some ridges in the interior of the peninsula that at certain periods of time during the Pliocene and Pleistocene were islands, and the rest of the peninsula was covered in water. Sort of zooming in a little bit, so the Lake Wales Ridge is the largest, one of the largest ridges in the peninsula, and you can see it on a satellite because you can see the light sand and almost a straight line running right down the middle of the peninsula, and formerly lots of citrus groves, so it has a really clear signature. Pre-settlement, the sandy soils and the green on here were pretty extensive throughout the ridge, and these are scrub soils, and then you'll see as by the time we got to 2003, much of that habitat was lost, just on the ridge, mostly to citrus primarily, early on, and then urban development, especially now that citrus is starting to fade. Statewide, the majority of scrub that we have is in Ocala National Forest. And of course, you know, at this scale, it's hard to see scrub, but you'll see little red dots. The Southern Lake Wales Ridge is sort of the next best patch of scrub, and some on Merritt Island. And you'll get a few different patches of scrub. Duet is right around here in northeastern Manatee County. And then you can't really see it very well, but there's quite a bit of coastal scrub along the coastlines of the Panhandle and along the Atlantic and southwest coast of Florida. Okay, natural processes in scrub. As with all the upland, almost all the upland habitats in Florida, other than hammock, it's a fire maintained community, but scrub is not an easily ignited community. So it has longer burn intervals. It doesn't have a very dense herbaceous component that has fine fuels that can carry fire. But once it does ignite, it burns really well, really hot, and usually kills a lot of the above ground biomass and knocks it down. Of the different types of scrub, they have somewhat different fire return intervals. In some cases, in all cases, we don't have really good historical data on what the natural fire return intervals were. For oak scrub, particularly on the Southern Lake Wales Ridge and the Merritt Island, they've inferred the natural fire return intervals based off of Florida scrub jay habitat requirements. So scrub jays really do not like if the oaks get over 3 meters high, and on Merritt Island, really sort of between around 1.5 meters high, they do best. And so they infer that fires probably came through every 5 to 20 years. 5 years is about how long it takes oaks to regenerate and produce acorns, which are important food source for jays. And 20 years is probably the upper limit before the oaks start to get too tall for the jays. Rosemary and sandpine scrub fire return intervals have been inferred based off of plant life history. So both of these species are killed by fire and then will germinate and regenerate from seed that's produced. And so the minimum amount of time for them to become reproductive and establish viable populations is about 10 years after fire. And after about 40 years, the plants start to decline. Sandpine's susceptible to root rot as it gets old, and the trees will die off. And the dead wood will add even more fuel. And likewise for rosemary, it seems to drop off in growth, start to die back, and seed production drops off as well. So generally longer fire return intervals than you'll see in other pyrogenic communities like flatwoods and sandhill. So why is scrub an important habitat? Well, as you might have guessed, with the extreme isolation in these communities, a lot of evolution happened for both plants and animals when these islands were isolated by high sea levels, and then in dry periods you could get new influx of migration and new species coming in here. So this table here, just looking at just the Lake Wales Ridge from a study done out of Archbold in 2006, identifies 36 focal species, one of which is a lichen. And then there's, I think, around 24, 26 plant species on here. So lots of endemic and listed plant species. The insect species, there's actually quite a lot more insect species that are characteristic of scrub. They focused on 2 of these species, 2 tiger beetles. And then three lizards, the blue-tailed mole skink and sand skink, which are ones that I've studied, and the Florida scrub lizard. The scrub jay, which is probably the most famous resident of the scrub, and the Florida mouse as well. Most of these species are very characteristic of scrub habitat. A few of them are more sandhill specialists. So things like Ziziphus, which common name is scrub Ziziphus, at least according to this, is identified as a sandhill species in yellow sands, but not a whole lot. I mean, at least I don't know a whole lot about it, other than they haven't even found it in natural scrub habitats. It seems to be in old pastures and things like that where it's hung on. Likewise, just sort of, I stole this table from the Natural Areas Inventory Guide to the Community, Natural Plant Communities of Florida. You get variation in rare species, not just on the Lake Wales Ridge, so I don't want to focus just on that, but several species, rare species of plants are found on the Lake Wales Ridge and other ridges. Some of these are like Florida bonamia, Ash's calamint, pygmy fringe tree, and then some are only found on either east or west coast ridges. Some are found just in other inland peninsula ridges as well. So a lot of these species are unique to very restricted areas of scrub. Other species, and I'll just give a quick background as I warned you before. My expertise is on lizards more than plants, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to them. The species I study while I'm out looking for plants, or vice versa, as the case may be, are the sand skink and the blue-tailed mole skink. So both of these are scrub specialists. They're both restricted to these upland habitats, either scrub or sandhill. The sand skinks are almost legless. They swim through the sand, and they're really adapted to this fossorial habitat. So they're only 4 to 5 inches long, generally sand colored, so gray to tan. They only have one toe on the front limb. You can see maybe right here, the one little front limb. That's pretty much all there is to it. And 2 on the hind limbs. You can see a little bit of a thigh, I don't know, along the back curve here. And then it's got a countersunk jaw, really wedge-shaped head, small eyes, and no external ears. So it's really built for an underground fossorial lifestyle. And it swims through the sand, just like a little eel, and leaves little, really distinctive tracks. Blue-tailed mole skink is the sand skink's closest relative. It's a little bit bigger, so it's up to 6.5 inches long. The tail, if the whole tail is present on the animal, and both species will drop their tails and regrow them, is usually over half the total length. It's got small legs, but significantly bigger than the sand skink, and it has all 5 toes on each foot. They're brown. On young individuals, they have a bright blue tail. They can fade to salmon or light pink in adults, or if they drop their tail and regenerate it, it may not be blue. So our interns, the first time they went out there, they're like, "What's this? Is this a brown skink?" Because it had a pink tail, and I was like, "That's a blue-tailed mole skink." And immediately they're like, "But the tail's not blue." And I was like, "I should have told you, they're not always blue-tailed." This is a subspecies of the mole skink that's more widely distributed throughout Florida and parts of Alabama and Georgia. It's distinguished from the peninsula mole skink primarily by locality, so it's hard to tell from the most closely related subspecies. But if you're on the Lake Wales Ridge and you see one of these, it's a blue-tailed mole skink. If you're off the ridge, it's not. And so here you see sometimes they even have almost purplish tails. Notably, it is not this young juvenile 5-line skink, southeastern 5-line skinks. So other than the sand skink, most of the lizard skink species in this genus, the juveniles all have blue tails when they're born. And for the southeastern 5-line skink, which is very common throughout the state, and especially quite common in more urban environments, it has an electric blue tail when it's young. But it has these distinct stripes on a black background and sort of the racing stripes on the head. As they get older, the males will get a reddish head, and everything will fade to a dull copper color. Sometimes the females, even as adults, will have a little bit of a bluish tail. but they're much bigger, more stout skinks on there. Just really quick on the evolution, as I said before, the sand skink and the blue-tail mole skink are sister species, so they're both very closely related. They both evolved on the Lake Wales Ridge when the islands presumably were isolated from the rest of the peninsula. The southeastern five-line skink is fairly closely related, but a little bit more evolutionarily distinct. Florida sand skinks are found, they have a wider range than the blue-tail mole skink. They're found in Ocala National Forest. There's some on the Sumter Upland around north of the Villages and Silver Springs area. The Lake Wales Ridge has 3 sort of genetically distinct populations. As you go from north central to the southern part of the Lake Wales Ridge, you get genetically unique populations. And then there's also some on the Lake Wales Ridge in Polk County that we don't know exactly where they group out, but we think they're most closely related to the central Lake Wales Ridge genotype. The blue-tail mole skink, as I mentioned before, it's a subspecies of mole skink. So there's, I think, 5 different subspecies throughout the state. Other ones of conservation concern are the Cedar Key mole skink, which has a very restricted range on Cedar Key and a few islands nearby, and the Florida Keys mole skink, which is found on the Florida Keys. The Florida Keys mole skink went through a federal listing petition by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They determined that the climate projections for sea level rise, they would only use up to 50 years instead of 100 years, and decided not to list it. And right after that, Hurricane Irma came through and knocked back some of the few populations out there. So there's a lawsuit to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list that. The Cedar Key mole skink is undergoing a listing review right now too, under the Endangered Species Act. The other species, the peninsula mole skink, is found throughout most of the rest of the peninsula of Florida. And I think the northern subspecies is called the red-tailed mole skink because it keeps a more red tail. Aren't listed, not super common, but that's because most of the time they spend their life underground, but seem to be stable in populations. So again, right here, the blue-tail subspecies is found on the Lake Wales Ridge. And then the species in general, looking at the genetics, you can see that the more evolutionary distinct lineages started on the Lake Wales Ridge, and then genetic data suggests that they spread out from there and diversified over time. Both species are listed as federally threatened. They were listed at the same time in 1987. They don't have any critical habitat designated. And the critical habitat listing, I should clarify, is for a specific place on a map. When they list critical habitat for a species under the Endangered Species Act, it's not a habitat type. It's a physical geographic area that is deemed important for that species, important for protection. The reasons are the same for any other scrub plant or animal: destruction and modification of habitat throughout the range. On the original listing, overutilization of the species from collectors was identified as a potential threat. I'm sure there are people out there that may have these or catch and keep those, but I don't think it's at a level that would put populations at risk. Big things are improper habitat management, specifically a lack of control of exotic plant species, and a lack of fire and inadequate regulatory mechanisms to offset the losses from development. I'm almost done talking about lizards, and then I'll have some plant pictures for you. Again, just sort of going over the ranges here. So some of the different ridges in central Florida and the peninsula of Florida are highlighted here. And these are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service element occurrence data for each species. So the sand skink here, lots of element occurrence records. Many of these areas have been developed, so don't think they're still there. But the Lake Wales Ridge is pretty robust. There's a handful that persist on the Winter Haven Ridge, although most of that has been developed. And then Ocala National Forest up here farther north has a pretty good number of records. These ones up here that are on the west side of the Ocklawaha River, so there's a big geographic barrier between them and Ocala National Forest, and the Lake Harris Cross Valley is on the south side. These populations weren't even known about until about 2014. So we think they're very genetically distinct on the Sumter upland. And one of the areas that FMPS protects, the Waria area, has, which I think is somewhere around up here, has sand skinks on it. So it's protected. And I think that was actually purchased partially with mitigation funds for Florida sand skinks. So it's a good example of conservation for an animal helping conservation for listed plants. Blue-tailed mole skinks have many fewer records on them. Much of this might be because they're active at a different time of year. So these guys breed in the winter and kind of settle down in the spring. The sand skinks breed in the spring, and that's when people do most of the surveys for the species because they're treated together. But we do know from research studies that it is a more rare species that's more restricted in its habitat than the sand skink. Both species seem to be limited in their distribution primarily by soils and elevation. So they require xeric, very well-drained soils, especially the sand skink needs loose sandy soils that it can swim through. If the soils get compacted or have a lot of organic matter and are loose, the skinks don't move through it, and they don't like to get above ground to move and disperse. They will, but they don't do it very much. Typically, they're at 82 feet above sea level or higher, sometimes as low as 70 feet above sea level. What's really interesting about the sand skinks is that the habitat condition and vegetation cover are generally not good predictors of their presence or their abundance. So they're typically associated with scrub and what some folks will call turkey oak barrens or sandhill habitats that are a little bit on the scrubbier side. But they've been documented from citrus groves, pastures, pine plantations, roadsides, and other disturbed areas, usually in the vicinity of other intact habitat, but sometimes, a quarter mile or more away. We do know for the sand skinks that leaf litter is important for attracting their arthropod prey. And we think it also helps moderate soil moisture and temperature levels. So the sand skinks can kind of go from wetter areas where they're not going to desiccate to drier areas if it's a little bit too wet. So they are susceptible to these loose xeric soils. Will dry them out like a sponge if it's not careful, if they can't sort of get up and move around to an area with relatively higher moisture content. Other microhabitat predictors such as soil moisture, soil compaction, they found contradictory results across studies, but it really sort of needs patches of open and shaded areas with patches of leaf litter that it can forage under. Most of the species that it eats, the arthropods, really like to occur in the leaf litter, and especially the oak leaves support more arthropod diversity than sand pine needles do. Blue-tailed mole skink, we know far less. It's very similar to the Florida sand skink. We never find them where there are not also sand skinks present. The reverse isn't true. You can find populations of sand skinks that don't have blue-tailed mole skinks, but not vice versa. Typically, sand skinks are more abundant, 7 to 10 times more sand skinks than you'll see for every blue-tailed mole skink. And almost all localities known for the blue-tailed mole skink are at or above 100 feet above sea level. Now I get to talk about management of the habitat and how we deal with it. So for both of these species and all species that are restricted to scrub habitat, effective management is essential for successful conservation. The optimal habitat for the lizards is a mosaic of open sand, abundant leaf litter, and patches of native scrub and scrubby flatwoods vegetation. For the skinks, genetic data suggests that prescribed fire at intervals of more frequently than every 10 years is potentially detrimental, where they will die from the fire, and they move around a lot more after fire. Probably it's a response to having to go farther to find patches for forage. We don't know exactly why, because they're very small and you can't track animals, put a tiny transmitter in them and get a signal from under the ground. So we don't know a lot about their individual movement. Mosaic of time since fire patches is important for other scrub species as well. Some of the rare scrub plants, like the perforate reindeer lichen, increase with time between fires. So if you have longer burn intervals, it does better. A lot of other scrub species, the Waria is a good example, the scrub eryngium and other species do better with more frequent disturbance and more frequent fires. So if you have sort of patches of long unburned and more recently burned habitat, you're going to maximize the diversity and the opportunities for a wide variety of species. With sand skinks, we have been able to translocate them to suitable recipient sites. So we have moved them to sites where they weren't known from before, and even 10 or 15 years later, they're doing fine and reproducing. And so restoration of areas that have intact soils does have a lot of potential for sand skink conservation. Blue-tail mole skinks, interestingly, at least as of sort of the early 2000s, most of the records we had from blue-tail mole skinks were on private lands and not on conservation lands. So they were a species that was identified as being very underrepresented in the existing conservation network at that time. And so some of these conservation measures that we've been using hopefully will help fill that gap. So both species, up until very, very recently, have been treated together under the Endangered Species Act by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So essentially, if Florida sand skinks were present in an area, they just assume blue-tail mole skinks are also present, at least on the Lake Wales Ridge. So the consultation area, which is a geographic area prescribed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where that specifies where surveys have to be done for listed species, includes the entire known range of Florida sand skinks, which overlaps with the entire known range of the mole skink. And basically within that consultation area, potential skink habitat is defined by a list of 20 soil types, most of which are very well-drained soils that are at or above 82 feet elevation. So projects that are on these soils at the right elevation are supposed to have sand skink surveys done, and they always get done if there's any federal money attached to the project. They're supposed to be done for private development, but sometimes things slip through the crack a little bit more. If there's potential skink habitat, the developers or the impactors can assume skinks are present. I've heard from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that they've actually stopped that policy, and so they require people to do surveys and determine the area occupied, rather than just not pay for surveys and just say, hey, we think it's occupied and we'll just pay mitigation for it. So if you don't assume they're present, you have to survey for sand skink tracks. And if you don't see sand skink tracks while walking around, you have to conduct cover board surveys, and those are just 2 foot by 2 foot pieces of plywood. It got really expensive during the pandemic, so I don't even want to think about what some people paid for 40 cover boards per acre on large tracts of land just in the plywood alone. And under those boards, look for sand skink tracks. So the sand skinks, when they're just sort of below the surface, swim through the sand and leave these very distinct tracks in the sand. So they have very sine wave shaped curves. You'll get beetles and millipedes and all sorts of other invertebrates that will leave tracks in the sand. They tend to be really squiggly. They don't have this nice sine shape where it's very, very distinctive for sand skinks. Blue-tail mole skinks don't leave tracks like this, or at least if they do, you can't tell them from sand skink tracks, but they don't quite move the same. So that's the primary reason why the species are treated together, because a skink can go under a cover board, leave a track behind, and doesn't have to be present for you to tell that it was there. The mole skinks, you would have to see that they're there. And I've caught a lot of them under cover boards, so they do hang out under there. But that's why they assume the presence of both species. Mitigation for these species, especially in the southern part of their range, it occurs through conservation banks. So if you're familiar with the concept of wetland mitigation banks, where any impacts to wetlands that are jurisdictionally under the state of Florida or the US government, the impacts have to be offset with the purchase of wetland credits that are either from the creation, enhancement, or restoration of existing degraded wetlands. Conservation banks work a little bit similarly, but they're for species or habitat rather than wetland mitigation. In the case of skinks, for every 1 acre of occupied skink habitat that's determined from those surveys I described, the impactor would have to purchase 2 acres or 2 credits from a conservation bank. And those conservation banks are private, generally private properties that have been set aside for conservation with perpetual conservation easements and an endowment fund that will pay for long-term management of the habitat. So for every acre of occupied skink habitat in a bank, they are awarded 1 credit. So if you have 300 acres of sand skink soils that have sand skinks on them, you get 300 credits, and then you sell those credits to developers. And once you sell 300 credits, you've sold everything in your bank. The price per credit depends on the market value. So if development rates are high, which they always are in Florida, and demand and supply is low, the price goes up. But in theory, if there were a lot of banks available and development slowed down, some of the bankers might lower the prices on that. But in addition to the banks, most of the banks that are permitted have existing good habitat because they don't get extra credit, so to speak, for restoring habitat. So the best banks are ones that have skinks present on them and have good intact habitat, because they don't have to spend money to restore the habitat. Some of the banks will be doing habitat restoration, but they make less money because they're subject to the same market price for credits as everybody else, but they have to spend money doing habitat restoration. So a lot of the banks that we permitted at Wildlands Conservation have really good intact scrub habitat, usually with some other areas that need to be restored. So some of the species here, we have Clitoria fragrans on some of our properties. This milkweed here is Curtis's milkweed, which is, I wouldn't say common, but is frequently found in most of the banks we manage. And then Britain's beargrass is one that I think every bank we have has some decent populations of Britain's beargrass. Florida bonamia is another one that's at every single bank I think that we manage. It's one of my favorites because it's easy to identify, even when it's not blooming, but when it is blooming, it's just really stunning plant. Some of the harder ones to identify, this is Stylisma abdita, so showy dawn flower. It's very small. These are my fingers in the corner. So very tiny little plants, but quite distinctive once you get a good search image for them. This on the right-hand side is Hypericum cumulicula, so scrub Hypericum that is restricted to Polk and Highlands County. Very sort of weird, distinctive basal leaves, and then these are the flowering stalks that have gone to seed. That's only one property that we manage has that species on it. Other plants on the left is Ashes calamint, which is a state threatened species. On the right is, I think, Cremeria. I can't remember the species name for Cremeria. And in the middle, not particularly rare, but just my favorite, especially when love bug season's out, because you can tell why tar flower gets its name, looking at all all the little love bugs stuck to it. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about scrub restoration. So some of the properties we have do have either areas that were formerly scrub and had been turned into pasture and are undergoing some restoration. One property is 300 acres of thin pasture that's going to all be restored, and it's adjacent to Tiger Creek that TNC manages, and Lake Wales Ridge State Forest, and that one is almost starting from scratch, except the soils are great and skinks are throughout it. So some of those areas are pasture. They've been seeded with bahia grass, and we're trying to get the bahia grass out and the scrub vegetation in. So in these cases, it starts with a few rounds of spraying the vegetation. So here you can see we sort of mowed it before we started. We actually burned a patch of it to sort of thin back the brush and make it a little easier to get in there and spray. And then we may do 1 or 2 treatments to try to knock back the grasses before we're ready to introduce some of the native plant species. So in this area, we got lots and lots of plants from the natives, but still we're only planting probably 12 to 15 species, none of them listed that have been propagated. So a lot of scrub Hypericum reductum, winged sumac, some yucca, and then the scrub oaks in here. And you'll see sort of this is actually after the restoration here. We've done a good job of at least opening up the sand. We didn't get cactuses. Those ones came up on their own or were there already. You can see maybe a few oaks coming in, but this is about 1.5 years later. We have some yucca that's established really well. Some of the Hypericum reductum is flowering really well. This is probably some stylisma that's recruited on its own. And then some of our favorite, because it grows so well, is Phase palafox, which is a really nice scrub plant that grows quite abundantly in the scrub, but not elsewhere. One word of caution and sort of a cautionary note here is on a lot of these soils, we don't have to, because they're so dry, we don't have quite the invasive plant pressures that wetlands and other species have. But 2 problem species we have for sure are Kogan grass and here the rose and the tall grass. That can become problematic if you don't stay on top of them. And even when we're disking fire breaks and sometimes areas where we've timbered to thin sand pines out, the machinery can bring in seeds for these species, and they're probably our biggest management concern, especially in the restored and more disturbed areas. This is just a small patch. It looks like a big patch the way it's the picture is taken, but I did want to leave here with a little bit of a cautionary note about some of the other problems. So with that, I'll take any questions. Is there anything in the chat? And I can sort of stop the screen share and open it back up.
At this time, we ask if anybody has a question for Dr. Halstead. You can go ahead and unmute yourselves. You can put your videos back on so we can see your lovely faces. And we are open for discussion. And I just have to say, I don't know, this is completely off topic, sort of, but I was watching the thing on your skinks and I couldn't help but think of Beetlejuice. Like,
it's my favorite Halloween movie.
Because you said that they swam. I'm like, oh my gosh, I wonder if they were the
sandworms. I should have put a sandworm picture in. I'll have to do that next time.
Oh, okay. So Tom Heitzman, he says, can you see trails in the sand, or do you need a piece of plywood?
So if you go in April and May and March when it's not raining all the time, yeah, you can definitely see trails in the sand out walking around. The problem is the rains wash the tracks away, so that's why we put cover boards out, is just primarily to keep them from getting washed out, but also there's some indication that the boards themselves keep the soil temperatures moderated a little bit and attract arthropods. So we think they may be hanging out under the board. Certainly in the winter months, when I've done surveys outside of the sand skink season, I've caught sand skinks and blue-tailed mole skinks under the boards, and they're probably thermoregulating under those boards, or maybe going in and eating some prey, because they'll attract termites and other bugs. I see Allison has her hand raised.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You were talking, this is really not in regards to plants, it's in regards to more of the vertebrate creatures, is that when you have these mitigation areas or conservation areas that developers have to, buy credits for, and I'm thinking specifically of gopher tortoises, but also skinks. Do you ever relocate skinks from one property to the conservation property, from the threatened property to the conservation property, to get genetic diversity or to maintain populations or to build populations?
That's a good question. For skinks, so we've done those studies. Well, I should say we've done those studies. My major professors, when I was a master's student at Henry Mission Skinner McCoy, have translocated skinks to areas that weren't occupied, and they do well. But no, this is unfortunately part of the problem with the mitigation for sand skinks, is it's not a no net loss thing. So if you have 2-to-1 mitigation for every acre of occupied habitat, you're saving 2 acres, but that means you're giving up on a third of the occupied habitat.
Right.
So there is a net loss. We don't, and it's just presence or absence. So we don't necessarily know how dense the populations are that are being lost versus what the abundance is like. We've done on some of our banks, we've gotten funding to look at population abundance of the skinks, and we've done some mark recapture analysis, but it's very costly to do those sorts of studies and estimate population abundance. So we don't know necessarily that the quality is equal. Generally speaking, most of the banks are in high quality habitat. Some of them have skinks and were being restored, and they seem to respond really well. That restoration area I showed pictures of didn't have any skinks. It was too full of grass for them to move into, but they've moved into it from the adjacent scrub in the matter of a few months since it opened up. So hopefully on some of those, but there's not a lot of habitat restoration. We do have one site where we're restoring habitat. That pasture area currently seems to have sand skinks using it, but at lower densities than we get in the intact scrub. And so hopefully that will really augment the populations a lot. But from a regulatory perspective, there's nothing that controls for that. Unlike the tortoise, where you have to physically move the tortoises somewhere, you can't leave them behind anymore.
Oh, that's good. I did not realize that.
Yeah, it creates its own problems, because then you need a place to put the tortoise, and we're running out of places to put tortoises. And also the places that are under private ownership that have a lot of tortoises don't make good recipient sites for tortoises, because they already have too many. So it may be a little bit of losing some highest quality habitat for stuff that might not be as good. But it's a tough thing, right? Like they have to go somewhere. And
I'd like one in my backyard.
Oh, I know, me too. It's so hard, but right now you can't do it. Not unless you have at least 5 acres, then you could become a waif site if you have 5 acres of tortoise habitat. So I could talk about tortoises for a long time. I see Damon has a question about isolation of individual populations, a concern for long-term genetic viability. That's a really good question. I think at the scale of the conservation banks, it's not, they certainly don't move very well, very far. The dispersal distance maximum is inferred from genetic data is probably 1 kilometer, but most of the time we think they're not moving much more than 100 feet, at least over the course of a year. And most of the banks are 250 or more acres, and the population sizes can be as high as 160 animals per acre. So at the scale of the conservation banks for sand skinks, I think we get very robust genetically robust populations that are viable long term. However, where banks are may not be protecting the genetic variability range wide. So Ocala National Forest is probably pretty secure because it's national forest and there's a lot of scrub habitat, but skinks aren't as abundant as they are on the Lake Wales Ridge. The central and southern Lake Wales Ridge have most of the skink habitat or skink banks. Northern Lake Wales Ridge and up north of there, there's not very much protected habitat. So that's probably the bigger concern is making sure we have representation of those unique, genetically unique areas throughout the range. Are skink banks also permitted as tortoise banks? Yeah, there are some cases of that. I think they have to be careful when you're managing for sand skinks and you're managing for tortoises at the same time. It can be a little bit tricky. Most of what we know about skinks is from scrub habitat, which tortoises certainly use, but isn't great for them because there's not a lot of herbaceous vegetation for tortoises to eat. So tortoise sites get maintained and get permitted if they have high herbaceous ground cover components. That may or may not be great for skinks, although skinks are found in sandhill. I just don't know what the densities are like. Blue-tail skinks nasty to taste from its predator? I don't think so, but I don't know. Certainly anything seems to eat them. I think the tail color is more a distraction from the important parts, namely the rest of the body, because they'll drop their tail and regrow it. Usually when it regrows, it doesn't have the color anymore. It's more reddish. And Tom says this shows how important it is to preserve as much habitat as possible. Absolutely. Both with the skinks and the tortoises, existing intact habitat is by far the most important thing to do. Protecting those areas, because anytime you do restoration, it's expensive and you're not going to get the full complement of species that are there, especially with the plant diversity. So managing for single species might work. You might get it to work for sand skinks, but it's not going to be, these restored sites are unlikely to be as good a quality biodiversity wise as the intact habitat.
Well, I think this is a good point to say thank you very, very much for being here with us. Anybody having any other questions for the Serenoa chapter, feel free to email us. We always make a point to check that out. And I wanted to say, I realized what I had spaced on regarding announcements. Chris Meyer was one of the, he's a member who basically sent us the program year. It was their main point of inspiration. So thank you, Chris Meyer, for all of your ideas and recommendations. It helped shape this whole year. And another note, segueing into our field trip, is that Ryan Inskeep, who is our Facebook coordinator, he's a talented landscape designer for native plants, and he's an active member with our chapter. He is going to be moving away. And so we wanted to take this time to thank him so much for his hard work and his dedication with the chapter, as well as elevating Florida native communities and our landscapes. He will be missed, but we wish him well. I think he said, was it Massachusetts he's going to? Did I get it right? I don't know. New England. He's going up to New England. So he's going to have to learn about a whole new habitat. And so, Dr. Halstead, we will be seeing you soon. Anybody who is going to our field trip, remember it is at 11:30 a.m. It is full, but you can always send in a request for the wait list. Sometimes things happen. Vermont, you moved to Vermont. And thank you, Allison. And so, yes, we have it this coming Saturday, 11:30 a.m. I'm super excited. Anybody needing a ride from Central Florida, you can reach out to me. And anybody else who's interested in carpooling, let us know via the email. And hopefully we can work out that. I'm looking forward to it. I'm grateful that you're here. I'm grateful that we see you again. Anybody, I think that's good for tonight.
All right. Thanks. And if people have questions, Rachel has my email, so we can get out. So look forward to seeing folks on Saturday.
Awesome. Yes, and everybody's like great informative talk. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Presentation. All
You're
right.
welcome. Thanks so much.
Okay. Have a great night, everybody.
Dr. Halstead.
Thanks, Neal. She answers.